Chodesh Tov, and welcome everyone to the final session of Prophet, Judge, and King in Deuteronomy with Rabbi David Silber, part of our Sfira Zman here at Drisha. It's always a pleasure to be learning with the founder of Drisha. For today, sources will be coming from Tanakh. If you have your own Tanakh, you're more than welcome to pull it out as a reference. To some extent, I will be sharing sources on screen from Sefaria when Rabbi Silber is directly quoting things. And with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to him.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the overall topic has been the institutions that the book of Devarim envisions when we come into the land. And essentially, we have pretty much one after the next, 4 different institutions that are mentioned. Beginning in Devarim chapter 16, beginning in verse number 18, it talks about the appointing of judges. Shoftim v'shotrim titem lecha b'chol sha'arecha. So we have judges. Now, in addition to having judges, which appear in the beginning of Parshat Shoftim, we also have a section which talks about, this is in chapter 17. We noted this in the past. We haven't really discussed this, but it says in chapter 17, verse number 8, what happens if you have a case, ki yipolei mimcha davar lamishpat, bein dam ledam, bein din ledin, bein nega lenega, divrei rivot b'sharecha. You have a matter, whether it's a matter, sounds like dam, sounds like homicide, or some other dispute, or nega, matters of a nega is in the book of Vayikra, a nega would be something like tzarat or something like that. It's not clear what the rule is. Does this qualify? Does it not qualify, etc.? Ki polei mimcha. The matter is too difficult. In other words, it sounds like the courts cannot figure out the answer. Then the Torah speaks. It says, "V'kamta v'yolita el hamakom asher yivchar Hashem Eloheh." It's the same verse, chapter 17, verse 8. It's a verse we once saw. You shall go up to the place that God has chosen. Now, the place that God has chosen is, as we saw earlier in the year, a very, very fundamental theme of Sefer Devarim. It appears over and over again in chapters 12 and 13, but the context over there was in terms of the sacrificial service. Sacrifices are to be brought in the book of Devarim in one particular chosen place. It never says what the place is, but it says it's a place that God will choose. As opposed to your own individual meat that you want to eat in your own houses. Once you come into the land and the chosen place may be far away from you, you are permitted to slaughter animals in your own spaces with certain conditions. I'm not getting into that. But in terms of sacrifices, it's the place that God has chosen, and that's a phrase that repeats over and over again in this book. But here we have a new aspect to the place that God has chosen. It's the place where you go to find out what the rule of law should be. And the Torah continues in chapter 17, in the next pasuk, in verse number 9, Uvato el ha-kohanim halviyim v'yel ha-shofet asher yiyeh b'yamim hahem v'darashta v'yidu lecha et dvar mishpat. So you should go up to this chosen place, and there you will encounter, here we have a very important expression, which appears many times in the book of Devarim, and I didn't want to talk about this a bit later today. You shall go to the Kohanim Leviyim. The question is, what does it mean, Kohanim Leviyim? We'll get back to that. And then it says, V'yel HaShofet, to the judge, who will be there at that time. So one of the questions, and V'darashta, and he refers either to the judge or the Kohanim Leviyim, will look into the matter very carefully, Drisha, to study something very carefully. V'yigidu lecha et dvar mishpat, and they will tell you what the law is. And then the Torah says you must follow what they said. V'yasita, you should do al pi hadavar asher yagidu lecha min hamakom hahu, Asher Yivchar Hashem. Very strange verse. You shall do what they told you to do with the rule, the thing they told you, which emerges from the place that God has chosen, and do everything that they say to do. Do not do otherwise. Verse number 11. Al pia Torah asher yorucha. The Torah they teach you have to follow. Do the judgment that they render you should do. Lo tosur min hadavar sheyagidu lecha yaminu shmol. Do not go to the right or the left. Do not depart at all from what they tell you. And then the next verse, but somebody who instantly decides, who does not listen to the Kohen or to the judge. He refuses to listen. That person is put to death. And so evil shall be swept out from Israel. This is a very interesting parsha, and our job in these classes is to figure out what the simple meaning of the text is. And this text raises a bunch of questions. I'll raise the questions. One question is, when it says you shall go up, who is it referring to? Who is going up to the place? Is it the litigant that's going up? I have a case with you. We can't, and we go to court. And the court says, we don't know. We can't determine. So then, do I go up? I say, okay, I'll take it to the, I'm commanded to go up. If I want justice, I should go up to the high court in the chosen place. Or does it mean that the court goes up? Does it mean that the people on the court, they can't figure out what to do? So they should go up and seek advice or seek judgment from the high court. That's one question. Who are we talking about here? Second of all, what is this business? Who are these judges? Because the Torah says actually two very interesting things. First, it says you shall go up to the Kohanim Leviim. Kohanim Leviim. Here, the translation in the JPS is Levitical priests. V'el hashofet, to the judge, they translate or the magistrate. So you got two choices, they're saying, this translation. You can go to the Kohanim Leviim, Levitical priests, but they're called Kohanim. Are they Kohanim or are they Leviim? What are they? Or and the judge, okay? So it sounds like there's two different possibilities here. Whatever Kohanim Leviim means, we'll get back to that. And they're going to tell you what to do. And then the third question is verse number 12. The person who refuses to listen to the judgment is put to death. That sounds like an extreme response. I lost the case in court. I owe you $100. I should pay it. I don't pay it. I'm put to death for that reason. Who is the ish in verse number 12? Is it the litigant who refuses to listen? That would be, sounds like it's possible. But is that, so we have here, in these sessions, the question is always, what is the plain meaning of the text? There's always the other question, which we don't deal with very often, which is, how has the rabbinic tradition understood the text? And when you look at those are two different things, and very often, the rabbinic understanding of the text does not appear at all to be the plain meaning of the text. The way the rabbinic tradition understands this parsha is that fundamentally, what the parsha is focused in on is what they call a zaken mamra. A zaken mamra is someone who's a great scholar, and the great scholar disagrees with the decision of the high court. High court makes a decision, but one of the members of the court, or someone who could be a member of the court, says, I refuse to accept this the judgment of the court. So the Gemara discusses what happens under those circumstances, and the commentaries on the Gemara discuss it further. And the distinction that's drawn in the rabbinic tradition is, the question is, are you allowed to disagree with the court? The court makes a decision. Do you have to accept it? or can you disagree with it? The court said X, I think it's wrong. So the basic distinction in the Talmud is you can certainly disagree with it. You can say they're wrong, but you can't act upon it, or you can't have other people act upon it. You can't come in and say, the court ruled X, but I ruled not X. Follow my ruling. That is not acceptable according to the rabbinic understanding of the parsha. But if I say you have to accept what the court says, I think they're wrong. That's another story. And then there's another question. What if you know they're wrong? It's another interesting question. It's not our province right now. They made the following decision based on certain facts, but you happen to know those facts are wrong. You don't have evidence for it, but you know it. Under those circumstances, what should you do? Should you follow the court, or should you not follow the court? And there's a great discussion about these questions. These are really pretty basic questions about authority. Should you follow the court? Because otherwise you have anarchy. You need some kind of final arbiters who can tell you what to do in order for the system to work. Or do you say, listen, I got to do the right thing. They made a decision. I think it's wrong. I can't, in good conscience, follow what they told me to do. It's a pretty basic question about, it comes up all the time. There are policies, government have policies, and you think the policy is wrong. What should one do? So I'm not going to get into that right now, but that's what emerges from this particular section. Let's put that aside for now, though these questions are very important. And I want to look at something else over here, which is this expression that we have here in chapter 17, and we'll encounter it again very, very soon, and that is HaKohanim Halviyim. What does HaKohanim Halviyim mean? So here the translation we have before us is the Levitical priests. So could have said Kohanim. And the term Kohanim Leviim, by the way, appears often in the book of Devarim. It appears no other place in the Torah. But in the book of Devarim, we have Kohanim Leviim. For example, let's take a look at what we were looking at last week, namely in chapter 17, verse number, let's start with verse number 18. Chapter 17, verse 18. This is the section that deals with the king. So the first part of this section is what a king is not permitted to do. Not to have excess, too many horses, too much money, too many wives, etc. That we talked about. And then in verse 18, we're told what the king should do. It says, Vayakish yifto al kisei mamlachto, v'katav lo et mishneh haTorah hazot al sefer milifnei haKohanim halviyim. When the king is seated on the throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching, this Torah. Here it says, actually, Mishnah Torah. So the king has to have a copy of the Mishnah Torah. What that means is a question. The book of Devarim in general is called Mishnah Torah. The whole book is called the Mishnah Torah. Does it mean that he has to write or have written a copy of the book of Devarim? And it's written, right, on a scroll. It says, by the Levitical priests, by the Kohanim Halviyim. And he has to carry it around all the time. And he reads, he has to read it. Or if he can't read, have it read to him. So there's a mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah for the king. And there's a mitzvah even to read it. And the reason is he has to observe the Torah. He can't be too haughty. He has to understand he's another commanded being. The rabbinic understanding, by the way, is that there's a mitzvah for everyone, at least for every man, maybe even possibly every woman, but the typical understanding is for every man to write a Sefer Torah. It's a mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah. If you can't write it yourself, you can have someone write it for you. According to some of the commentaries, it doesn't have to be a Torah, it can be a book. You can also you can write one letter and it counts as if you wrote the whole thing. But actually, in the list of commandments, 613 commandments, the 613th commandment is to write a Sefer Torah. And the truth of the matter is that the Torah itself never explicitly commands anybody to write a Sefer Torah. The question is, how from the Torah do we find the mitzvah for at least every man to write a Sefer Torah. So the source is based on a verse that comes later in the book of Dvarim. Hopefully we'll continue our study of Sefer Dvarim. I'm going to be adding some classes in June. I decided to add 4 more classes. We'll get to that later, but it never explicitly says to write the Torah. But it does say that the king has to write the Mishnah Torah, but he writes it lifnei ha-kohanim halviyim. It's another example of where we have the phrase kohanim leviyim. And the question is, what does it mean? So let's leave the question for a moment. And just for one moment, but we have over here, in terms of institutions, we have some kind of a high court. The high court is found in the place that God has chosen. Before I get to this question of Kohanim Leviyim, which is the main thing I want to talk about, I did want to make another suggestion. And once again, this is completely contrary to the rabbinic tradition. But it does seem to me to be Pshuto Shel Mikra, what the Torah seems to say here and elsewhere. And the question is, when you go to the high court, and the court is going to render a decision based on what? How does a court render its decision? The high court, the ultimate authority. So in the rabbinic tradition, this is very central to the rabbinic tradition. The rabbinic tradition understands that decisions about law are made through human understanding, through the vidarashta, through the study, careful study of precedent, study of exactly the case. And what the rabbinic understanding emphasizes is that when it comes to law, the prophet has no role. Even though it doesn't necessarily sound that from these texts that we have looked at the last couple of weeks, when Moshe talks about the Navi, the prophet, in chapter 18, as we studied, Moshe says, you don't listen to other kinds of diviners or sorcerers or whatever, but there will be a prophet that I will raise up amongst you like me. Navi okim lahem mikerev achehem kamocha. That's chapter 18, verse 18. V'notati dvarai b'fiv, v'diber alehem et kol asher atzavenu. And I says God will command the prophet the same way I commanded Moshe. The same way after Sinai, when you said we don't want to hear God's voice anymore, and God said, "Okay, but I'll tell you what I'm thinking, and you will relay it to the people." And Moshe says in chapter 18, and we studied this already, after I'm gone, says Moshe, another prophet will arise like me, Kamoni. The rabbinic tradition understands that not to mean that the prophet will actually give laws. In the rabbinic tradition, prophets do not give laws. It's one of the fights of the Rabbinites and the others, the Karaites, etc. They believe prophets can give laws. But the rabbinic tradition was very strict about this. The prophet does not give law. The prophet can teach morality. The prophet can talk in generalities. The prophet can tell you to observe the law. But the prophet does not create law. That's the rabbinic tradition. But when you read the Chumash, it doesn't actually necessarily sound that way. Because Moshe says, just like me, just like I, after the 10 Commandments, you said, we don't want to hear God's voice. You tell us. And Moshe goes up the mountain and God instructs Moshe all kinds of laws, and Moshe relays them to the people. It sounds from the Torah in the book of Devarim that some other prophet could do similar things. The rabbinic tradition, for any number of reasons, does not interpret that way. But I mention all of this because the question is, when you go up to it says the priest, the Levite priest, or the priest, or to the judge. Does it mean or the judge, or does it mean the Levite priest is the judge? Or does it mean the two possible kinds of judges? I just want to raise the possibility. It's simply what the Torah seems to say, the plain reading of the Torah, is that the Torah suggests that two different kinds of judges. You can receive the answer in two different ways. One way to get to an answer is you go to the high court scholars, the ultimate authority, and they're going to engage in drisha or drisha v'chakira elsewhere. To look at the matter very carefully, look at precedent, look at the logic, look at the evidence, and then render a decision. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that you can go to the priest, right, the Levite or the priest, who's not a judge in that sense, but who's in the place that God has chosen, who has access to God because it's the place from which God speaks. And the Kohen and the Levi, the Kohen and the Levi, has access to God. Kohanim Leviim, let's say Kohanim who are Levites. Well, I'll get back to that. But in any event, the idea of the Levi, Moshe was a Levi, the idea of the Levi as one who has access to God, not through intelligence, but access through revelation. There are two different ways to receive the answer from God. We remember, for example, when Moshe was sitting by himself in Parshat Yitro, coming to the holiday of Shavuot, right, the receiving of the Torah, which is in chapter 19 and 20 of the book of Shemot. But in chapter 18, Moshe is sitting by himself, judging the people. And Yitro, his father-in-law, says to him, "What are you doing here? You're sitting all by yourself." And Moshe says, the people want answers. The people seek God. And Yitro says to Moshe, "You can't do that. Can't be one judge for all the people." But Moshe had different thinking. Moshe said, "What do you mean? But I'm the only one who has access to God. Justice and judgment can come only from God. We have no right to judge the other person." So Moshe says, "They come to me because I have access." And Yitro says to Moshe, "It's a beautiful concept. It makes perfect sense. Just one small problem. It can't possibly work. Therefore, you need a system which on one hand allows people to get some kind of justice. On the other hand, there will be cases that are too difficult for the people, and only you can answer, or maybe more appropriately, only God can answer." And Moshe accepts Yitro's advice, and Moshe appoints all kinds of judges, but the matters that are too difficult for the people, they go to Moshe, and Moshe can address God. And we have that in the Chumash, minimally on two occasions. The daughters of Tzlofchad, they had a case. Moshe did not know the answer. Moshe turns to God. The story of the Pesach Sheni, people that could not bring the Paschal sacrifice, we'll read it in a couple of weeks. And they said to Moshe, "Why should we be excluded from the Paschal sacrifice, from the Karban Pesach?" And Moshe says, "Let me consult with God. Let me see what God has to say about this." So that model, basically, of judging on one hand, but certain matters that are too difficult you bring to God, that's a model that we have encountered in the Chumash, in Parshat Yitro, and we actually have actual cases where Moshe will bring the case to God. Actually, in the case of Tzlofchad's daughters, twice, both in terms of inheritance and the question of whom they can marry, which is the last chapter of the book of Bamidbar. Once again, Moshe turns to God. Moshe doesn't know how to respond, but God tells Moshe what to do. So, in other words, my point is, when you read the Chumash here in Dvarim, chapter 17, you go up to the Kohanim Leviim and to the judge, or to the judge. Maybe the best reading of the Chumash here, the plain reading, is these are two different ways. Sometimes I presume you go first to the judge. If the judge can't answer, maybe there's another way to get the answer, which is to work through those that have access to God, and that's going to happen in the place which God has chosen. There's a connection between the place that God has chosen as temple, as sanctuary, and place that God has chosen as a place where one can receive a response to a question. It's interesting that the Sanhedrin is what's called Lishkat HaGazit. The Sanhedrin was half the Sanhedrin was located. It's in a circular, but it's located within, but not quite in the temple. So we have that connection. I mean, one could understand it differently. The rabbinic understanding was, instead of receiving revelation, we now rely upon human comprehension. Human comprehension. The prophet is, in a sense, replaced. The prophet as a lawgiver. Moshe as a lawgiver is replaced by people or scholars studying the law to figure out what to do. We don't rely on what comes from heaven, lo b'shamayim, but in terms of the plain reading of the text, one can read it the other way. Before I stop and take
That's
comments and
like
questions.
Tanur Achnai.
Yeah, the story of that's exactly that story. Tanur Shalachnai. There are other cases as well. Lo b'shamayim. I just want to point out that if you actually don't assume the rabbinic position that that judgment is based just on human knowledge, and you go back and read, for example, the set of laws in the book of Shemot, there it's interesting when you read it with approach it this way, that with sort of an open mind in this sense, you realize that sometimes it says you have a case and it talks about going to the court and the court imposes some kind of an oath. Sometimes it says you should approach God. Elohim. So sometimes it uses the term Elohim, and sometimes it talks about going for uses a different term. Now, the rabbinic understanding is Elohim refers to the judge. However, when you read the Chumash, generally speaking, Elohim does not refer to a judge. Elohim typically refers to God. So I'm saying even within the set of laws in the book of Shemot, if you approach it without preconceptions, just read the words. It sounds like there are two different options. That sometimes the only way to find out the truth, there's certain things that no one can figure out. There's just no evidence, and we can try our best. There are certain cases where only God can tell us what really happened. We have this, certainly have it in one case in the Chumash, which is the Sota. In the case of the Sota, we have a suspicious husband. We have no evidence. We have no witnesses. So there you take the matter to God. The question is, apart from the Sota, is that completely anomalous? There's no other such case? Or does the Torah, at least, the plain reading of the Torah, accept the possibility that sometimes someone kind of oracle, someone can go to God and inquire of God, and God will provide the answer. The institution we've talked about till now are basically judges and the high court. We discussed the prophet, we discussed the king, and we discussed the court. So, yes.
All
Any
right.
comments or questions? Yes, Kayla.
Nothing in the chat, so I'm going to start things off with Deborah, since I saw you had a hand up, and then we'll move to other questions.
Yeah, I was thinking that another example is Velokemi Nali Yado, that Hashem, it's used, when you don't know, when it has, when Hashem sets it up about I think Horeg Shogeg B'Mezid,
Yes.
and with the ladder, that
the
story.
unpremeditated killed.
Right.
Yes. There, right. Yes. And there it's sort of God setting something up.
But he's also involved with the courts, involved with the justice. That's what I mean.
Yeah, there's actually another case, which is actually in that same parsha at the beginning of Mishpatim that you're referencing. You have the idea that of the city of refuge. You have the idea that going to the sanctuary actually is a place of refuge. In the Chumash, now you do have it somehow. The sanctuary, the temple, the holy place provides a certain, it's called a sanctuary, right? It provides a certain kind of shelter. That you do have, but the idea of actually rendering a decision based on what you hear from God to be saying is something that the rabbinic tradition rejects completely. And there could be many good reasons to actually reject that, because you're not relying on evidence. Someone says, God told me this, and the question is, okay, we do have the idea of prophecy. When it comes to making rules, laws, and stuff like that, our tradition has been very reluctant to go down that path.
But I guess as long as Moshe is alive, they can use him as a conduit, and they do when it's the Makalel, when it's the Makoshesh, when they don't know, they say, okay, can you have a quick consult and let us know what to do. When he's not there anymore, then that you can't use plan A. then you have to go to
Agreed,
something else.
agreed. And
Nobody's
no
a substitute for Moshe.
Right. Now, let me say just two other things about this. First of all, there's no question when you read the medievals, the Rambam, for example, is very strict about Moshe's prophecy is wholly other. We talked a bit about this, but part of it is no question in my mind that part of saying Moshe is different. His prophecy is on a different level. His prophecy is the prophecy of Moses is Torah. No one else's prophecy is Torah. Is a way, without question, and it's pretty explicit in the Rambam, to safeguard Jewish tradition from others who would say Moshe was a great prophet, but we have even a greater prophet who's going to overturn Moses' rulings. So the idea of saying Moshe's Torah can never be overturned, and no prophet can come and give us new permanent laws. The prophet can, in the Jewish tradition, say, if it's a real prophet, can say, for a limited amount of time, you're not to observe a certain mitzvah. That, the Talmud says, the prophet can do. But the idea of instituting a kind of different Torah, because the prophecy is greater, that's something that the Jewish tradition, the Rambam, and many others were very worried about. Other religions can come and say, yes, we accept the Torah, but now we have a new revelation which supersedes part of the reluctance to rely upon any other prophet is precisely that, and it's pretty much explicit in the Rambam. So they were solely concerned about that. But in any event, this idea that not relying on God's word, lo b'shamayim, that's ancient. That's already in the Talmud, and you mentioned Tanur Shalach Noi, and it comes up in many places. Having said that, I just wanted to say these are big topics. Having said that, within the Kabbalistic tradition, there's this idea of Gilui Eliyahu, that somehow that Eliyahu Hanavi is seen as one who does impart, who does tell you what to do. Within that tradition, there's a whole range of opinions about Gilui Eliyahu. Now, Eliyahu Hanavi, anybody who studied Eliyahu knows that the character of Eliyahu is based upon Moses. Eliyahu's entire character is based on Moshe. So the idea of Gilui Eliyahu, which has an interesting history to it and a fascinating topic, is a way, in a certain sense, of suggesting that God does continue to teach. There is a Torah that comes through a prophet, but the prophet is Eliyahu, and it's a Gilui Eliyahu. It's never that he's going to give us a new Torah. They would never say that, but there are all kinds of insights, etc. And broadly speaking, Torah, which can come to us through revelation. The revelation of Eliyahu was also Moshe, actually, it's the second Moses. But these are big topics. In any event, the first point I wanted to make is that a suggestion that the high court over here can be read as the two different ways. There's the priest, the Levite priest on one hand, and there's the judge on the other, as opposed to saying that the Levite is the judge. Now, saying that the Kohen and the Levi are the judges, which is the rabbinic way of seeing it, has good roots in the Torah as well. We do know, for example, that the Torah in the book of Vayikra talks about the Kohen as making certain decisions. The whole wrote that Bnei Israel, in terms of leprosy, of course, that's true, but the Torah speaks of distinguishing Tamei and Tahar, Kodesh and Chol. That's the province of the priest. Here you have, though, in the book of Devarim, this phrase Kohanim Leviyim, which I want to focus on next. Now we come to some very difficult verses, very difficult. And I saw a suggestion about this that I want to tell over, and I want to add something to it, because I think it's a very, very interesting suggestion. I happen to agree with the suggestion, and it's something to think about. And we have the following. So at the end of chapter 17, we talked about the king. I'm not going back to the king anymore. The Torah, I'll say one thing about the king. The Torah itself never says what the king does. It's very remarkable. So we want a king like the other nations. You want a king like the other nations, okay, it's one that God would choose, shouldn't be too haughty, writes the Sefer Torah and even reads it, not have too much, not bring the people to Egypt. That's what the Chumash says. We talked about all those things. But what is the job description? What is this guy doing what does he do for a living, the king? So it doesn't say. Where it does say it explicitly is in the book of Shmuel, when the people request the king. The people in the 8th chapter of Shmuel Aleph request the king. And they say, give us a king like all the other nations. Exactly what they say. And later in that conversation with the prophet Shmuel, who's against kingship, the people said, we want a king. Shmuel tries to discourage them. He's going to steal, he's going to rip you off, he's going to take, he's going to take, he's going to take. And the people say, we don't care. We want a king to judge us and to fight our wars. That's what they say. Ushvatanu malkeinu, v'yatzal lefanenu, v'nilchamat milchamotenu. We want a king to judge, a shofet, and we want a king to fight. And the interesting question, which is beyond the scope of today's shiur, but the interesting question is, what exactly is the role of the king as a judge? What kind of judgment does the king do? The Talmud itself, the tractate Sanhedrin, which deals with the courts, has one chapter about the king. It's very unclear what the king judges. What is clear is that the Talmud gives the king a lot of power when it comes to protecting his own kingship. Someone can be determined to rebel against the king, a mored b'malchut, and the king has all kinds of powers. The king can eliminate this fellow, etc., etc. That's clear. And the Talmud is concerned with how much power exactly the king has, what a king can do, what a king can't do. But I just want to make one observation, which I think is an interesting one, something for everybody to think about, which is this. If we think about the Bible, and we think about the king as a judge, how many times do we encounter the king making a judgment? So I can think of one example where the king actually is a judge. And the example I'm thinking of, famous example,
The
is the
babies.
story that's found in the beginning of exactly, everybody's familiar, right? The two women come to the two prostitutes actually, and each one had a baby. But one of the babies died and one of the baby is alive, and each one claims that the live baby is hers and the baby that died belongs to the other woman. That's the case in the beginning, and there's no there are no witnesses. There's nobody else in the house. They're living in this house. There's nobody around. There's no evidence. How do you decide a case when there's no evidence? And Shlomo, the case is brought to Shlomo, and as we all know, he figures it out. He's able to figure it out by making these strange suggestion that we don't know what to do. The first Mishnah in Bava Metzia, two people come, each one's holding on to a garment. Each one says it's theirs, says the Mishnah, divide it. So that was Shlomo's answer. Okay, we'll cut the baby in half. You take half, you take half. And the real one woman says, that sounds reasonable. That sounds reasonable. And the other one says, no, let her have the baby. And Shlomo says that's the real mother. The real mother wouldn't want her child to be killed, etc. That's just about, off the top of my head, the only case I can think where a king makes a judgment. There is the king is actually a judge. There's no evidence, the king judges. But we do have other cases, where the king is a judge, and there are 3 of them in the book of Shmuel. On 3 different occasions in the book of Shmuel, the king makes a judgment. I'll mention one that's familiar to everybody who's listening, and that is the following case. David's good friend, Nathan the prophet, goes to King David in the end of chapter 11 of the first book of Shmuel, and says to the king, second book of Shmuel, Shmuel Beis Perek Yud Aleph, says, King, I have a following case. Maybe you can help me with it. There's a town, and there's a rich man and a poor man. And the rich man has many, many animals. The poor man has no animals. He has one little ewe, one little lamb that he purchased and takes care of and feeds her and gives her food, and she rests in his bosom. And then some stranger came to town. And the rich guy came to the rich guy. The rich guy didn't want to take any of his own massive flock. So he takes the one little lamb of the poor guy, slaughters it, and gives it to the stranger. What is the rule in that case, O king? And David was infuriated, very angry. A guy like that deserves to die. He should pay 4 times. which is what the Torah says when you steal a lamb. By the way, you pay 4, slaughter a lamb, you pay 4 times. He should pay 4 times, and he deserves to die because he has no pity. And Nathan said to David, "You are the man." Now, that's one of 3 cases in the book of Samuel where the king judges. And the cases, actually, the judgment, there's 2 in Samuel and there's a case in Malachim. In all 3 of those cases, the judgment is about the king himself. The king is making a judgment. It's true in that chapter. It's true later when the women from Tekoa go. Can't get into it now. So it's very interesting that the king as judge in the book of Samuel, and the classic example is David and Bathsheba. It's a David Bathsheba story. He's a judge, but he judges himself. So you got to wonder about that, to what extent, in terms of the Pshuto Shamikra, what kind of judge is the king? Self-judgment, yes. In any event, it's very striking, though, that the Torah never tells us what a king does. It must assume that the reader knows. The reader knows exactly what kings do. And they say, like all the nations around us. So presumably, everybody knows what the other nations around us, their understanding of what a king is. So we have the king. We discussed the prophet. We saw there's a high court. There are courts and a high court. There's an obligation to have courts in b'chol she'arecha, in all of your gates. Shoftim v'shotrim tikenu lecha b'chol she'arecha. But when you don't know what to do, you have divrei rivot b'sharecha, quarrels within your gates. Then you go up to the high court. So we have these 3 different. We have a prophet, we have a king, we have judges. And now there's one other group of people that we have. And that's in chapter 18, verse number 1. Here we have some very difficult verses. And I'm going to make a suggestion. Lo yiyeh la'kohanim halviim, chapter 18, verse 1. Lo yiyeh la'kohanim halviim, kol shevet Levi, chelek v'nachalav Yisrael. Ishe Hashem v'nachalato yochelun. So the chapter begins by saying Kohanim Leviim. The Kohanim Leviim, all the tribe of Levi, shall have no territorial portion. They are to live off God's offerings. Nachalo lo yelo b'kerev echav. They have no portion with the other brethren. Hashem nachlato. God is their portion. Kasher diberlo. So we know in the book of Bamidbar, other tribes gave cities to the Leviim. The Leviim have no separate portion within Israel. And when we traveled in the desert around the Mishkan, which is at the center of the camp, and we're just reading these parashiot now in the book of Bamidbar, we know that there are 12 tribes, 4 groups of 3 surrounding east, southeast, northwest, surrounding the Mishkan, and the Leviim are living around it separately. They live separate from the people, in between the people and the Mishkan. So the Leviim, even in the desert, are separate. After the Golden Calf episode, the Civil War, the tribe of Levi is separated out. They don't dwell around with the others. It's like if you kill an unpremeditated murderer, goes to the city of refuge. Well, the Leviim are living permanently in cities of refuge. And the rabbinic understanding, by the way, interesting, is that apart from the 6 cities of refuge, the Levite cities themselves serve as cities of refuge. Fine. In any event, that's how chapter 18 begins. No portion for the Leviim, but it starts Kohanim Leviim.
Doesn't the king in capital cases have the power to order an execution when there is not sufficient evidence for the court to do so?
Yes, he does. He most certainly does. The king has all kinds of powers. The question is what limits are placed upon those powers. I mentioned before, it's called the Morid B'Malchut. And, the question is to understand, that's why it's in a way so dangerous, because it's very unclear what these powers, how far these powers extend. And one can easily understand how a king could very liberally interpret this idea of anybody who is a Morid B'Malchut. That's an interesting question. It comes up in the Talmud in the David Bathsheba story. I mean, the Talmud in general's take on kingship is very interesting. That's a whole. I once gave a series of lectures about that, about the image of King David in the Talmud. But you're 100% correct, of course, and that is that the king has rights, but those typically are situations that the king is directly affected by or threatened by. But again, one could easily, from our perspective, understand the great danger in giving a ruler too much power. That is clear. And when you read the Tanakh, such as the book of Shmuel, you could understand how people in power, they can exercise that power to accomplish what they want to accomplish without ever taking any responsibility for it. The David Bathsheba story is a perfect example. He wants to get rid of Uriah Hittite for his own reasons. He prefers not to kill Uriah. He tries to solve his problem a different way. But at the end of the day, he has him killed. And if not for God's intervention, nobody will ever know the difference, because he doesn't kill him himself. He has the enemy kill him in battle after instructing his general. So we understand the great dangers, but no question that the king has all kinds of powers. Certainly in the Tanakh, and the rabbinic tradition wrestles with this as well. Fine. Now let's get to the following verses, which is the one thing I wanted to put out there for everybody to think about before we resume in several weeks, before more classes. But v'zeh yiyeh mishpat hakohanim me'et ha'am, me'et tzovchei hazevach im shorim seh, v'natan lakohen hazaroa ha'achayayim ve'akeva, reshit degancha tiroshcha v'yitzarecha, reshit geis toncha titen lo. Ki bo bachar Hashem Elokecha mikol shvatecha lamod l'sharet b'shem Hashem hu uvanav kol hayamim. Here we have the following. It doesn't say Kohanim Leviim. Here it says this is the priests do, the Kohens do from the people, from those who zovchei hazevach, who slaughter the animals. Here they translate offer a sacrifice. I'm not sure that's right. He shall give to the priest three things: cheeks, shoulder, the cheek, and the stomach. Zrol l'chayayim in keva. And then the next verse says, you shall also give the first fruits of your new grain, reshit, and then the first shearing of your sheep. For God has chosen him from all the tribes to stand before God and to serve, he and his children, for all time. So what is over here? We have gifts. It sounds like gifts to the priest. But what's interesting is that these gifts to the priest mentions three kinds of things. Two of the three were never mentioned before in the Torah. The Torah in the book of Bamidbar, chapter 18, lists what kind of things are given to the priests. Matnot kehuna. But it does not list two different things. It doesn't list, number one, what it says in verse number 3, Zeroa l'chayayim in keva. It doesn't list it there. And number two, it doesn't list the first shearing of your sheep. It says completely new. Now the understanding of the Mishnah, the rabbinic tradition, is that these gifts, namely the shoulder and the cheek, stomach, and also the first shearings, Reshit Hagez, and the Zeroa l'chayayim in keva, are not given from sacrifices. Has nothing to do with sacrifices. When it says Zovchei HaZevach, it does not mean, as the JPS translates it, offer a sacrifice. It means slaughter an animal. As it said earlier in this book, when you come into the land and you're far away from the temple, you can slaughter the animal in your own house and eat it. So this business of giving these gifts to the priest, and these gifts have no inherent sanctity as far as the Talmud's concerned. They're simply gifts that are given from every animal that you slaughter. You give the shoulder, the cheeks, and the stomach. But it comes up today. The big question is, what do we do with all the kosher slaughterhouses? Of course, they're not giving away these things from every animal to the priest. That's for sure. So how do you get around it? That's the question. But in any event, this is all new. But the understanding is these are gifts to the Kohanim. No mention of the Levi whatsoever. God has chosen them to stand and serve. Lamod l'sharet. Fine. The next section is the puzzler. V'chiyavo halevi me'achad shi'arecha mikol Yisrael asher hu garsham uba b'chol avat nafsho El hamakom asher yivchar Hashem V'shereit b'shem Hashem Elohav. Kechol echav halviyim ha'omdim sham l'fnei Hashem. Chelek kechelek yochelu levad mimekarav al ha'avot. I'll read the translation here. These are difficult verses, difficult in more than one sense. The translation says the following. If a Levi goes from any settlement throughout Israel, where he has been residing to the place that God has chosen, he may do so whenever he pleases. He may serve in the name of God like all his fellow Levites who are in attendance. They shall receive equal shares of the dues without regard to personal gifts or patrimonies. So what is this talking about? Here it doesn't say Kohanim Leviim. Here it says Kiyavo HaLevi. The Levi is coming to do what? The Levi comes from one of your gates. It says El HaMakom Asher Yivchar Hashem. He goes to the place that God has chosen. He goes to the temple. V'shereit, he shall serve. He shall serve, right? Like all his fellow Levites. And he shall divide the portions equally apart from, or without regard to, personal gifts or patrimonies. Levadimim karav al ha'avot. These three verses are a puzzler. What is it referring to? So first of all, let's get to the rabbinic understanding of these verses. Because what it sounds like, when you read it, what it sounds like is that here's the Levi. He's called the Levi. He's going up to the temple to serve. Now, when you go up to the temple to serve, the Kohanim will serve in the temple. So what do? The Kohanim will serve in the temple. They do the sacrificial service. In fact, after the slaughtering of the animal, all the other pieces of the sacrificial service, the collecting of the blood, the throwing of the blood, the burning of the animal, those are done by priests. They're not done by non-priests. They're done by priests. And the simple reading of the Chumash is they're not done by the Levi either. And the Kohen, in return for this work, gets a part of the animal. Many of the animals, the sacrifices in general are divided into two categories. Holies, or the lighter ones, Kochim Kalim, and Koche Koshim. They're holier and less holy. The holier animals, Kodesh Kodashim, apart from the burnt offering, which is totally burned, part of the animal is always eaten. But when it comes to the animals that are called Kodesh Kodashim, Koche Kodashim, only the priest eats them. When it comes to the other animals, the Shlamim, the priest eats part, and the one who brings it eats part. But the priests are eating, that's their meal, that's their food. They eat of all these different sacrifices. So here it talks about Chelok Kechelok Yochelu. It sounds like this Levi, let's call him a Kohen for our purposes now, he can come and get his portion, apart from Mim Karav al Ha'avot. So first, let me just say what the traditional commentaries say about this, and then make another suggestion. The traditional understanding is that the Levi is not a Levi. Every Kohen is also a Levi. Every Kohen is from the tribe of Levi. But what's referring to over here is a Kohen. If he's a Kohen, why is he called a Levi? Very good question. So the Rashbam explains the following way. What lies behind the classical commentaries, the Rashbam, the Ramban, Rashi, all of them, is the following idea. That the priests who serve in the temple they have a schedule. They have a mishmar. That there were 24 mishmarot in the temple. The Talmud discussed this at length. In the book of Divrei Hayamim, it sounds like there are various groups that come together, families that come together. Each one serves 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, they eat the sacrificial portions. On the festival, there are many, many sacrifices on the festival, all the priests can equally serve. But during the year, there's the mishmar. So if I'm a priest, these are my 2 weeks. These are my 2 weeks. Fine. What about somebody? Fine, that's called the mishmar. There were originally X number of mishmarot, and eventually there are 24 mishmarot. Fine. Now, what about if I'm a priest? I have my own personal sacrifice to bring. I want to bring my own personal sacrifice. So I can do that. I go up to the temple to bring my sacrifice, and a rabbinic understanding is that the sacrifice that I bring out of my own goodwill, that sacrifice I can eat. I get a portion of that sacrifice. It's not the sacrifices that are brought by members of the mishmar that I can't eat, even though I'm there with them, but I can only eat my own. And that's the understanding of chelok kechelok yochelu levad mi mikarav ha'avot. And the Rashbam says, if he's a Kohen, why is he called a Levi? Says the Rashbam, he's called a Levi because during the year, when it's not his turn to serve, he's no better than any Levi. Every Kohen is in fact also a Levi, obviously, but the point, the tribe of Levi. The Rashbam says, the Rashbam accepts the rabbinic understanding, says, listen, someone wants to bring his own personal sacrifice. B'chol avat nafsho. He desires to do it. Says the Torah, he can do it. And he gets a portion of it as well. But not from the other animals. Levad mim karav ha'avot, not the portions that belong to those whose service has been determined already from the past. They have a certain time they come up there. That's their tradition. These 2 weeks belong to this mishmar. That I can't get. That's one way the tradition reads this section. The other way to read it, Levad mim karava ha'avot, means, according to some, that not only if this priest wants to bring his own sacrifices, but let's say his brother wants to bring a sacrifice, or some other relative wants to bring a sacrifice, it gives it to him, he's also entitled. That which he has inherited or been given from others, then it's an inclusion. He can not only go to bring his own personal sacrifice, any sacrifices that's a personal sacrifice, he can also eat of it. But he can't eat of anything else, because everything else belongs to the mishmar. That is one way to read it. And the point I'm making is, if you read it this way, the Levi is actually a Kohen. The problem with the interpretation, when you're thinking about the plain reading of the text, it's one simple problem. It doesn't say Kohen. It says Levi. In the previous section, it talks about the Kohanim. Mishpata Kohanim, right? In this section, it says Levi. In the first section, beginning chapter 18, it says Kohanim Leviim. Earlier in this book, and we saw this when it talked about the sacrifices that are brought on certain festivals, you go up or you bring the tithe up to Jerusalem. Do not forsake the Levi. It only mentions the Levi there. It never mentions the Kohen. Do not forsake the Levi. And we understand this because the Levi, the Kohen at least gets the sacrificial portions. But the Levi, what does the Levi get? Yes, the Levi does get a tithe. But the book of Devarim never mentions the tithe to the Levi. The rabbinic understanding, of course, is it's all get resolved. So the tithe, the Levi that's mentioned in other books of the Torah, in Vayikra, etc., book of Devarim presumes that. That's the rabbinic understanding. But if you read the book of Devarim differently, it talks about the Maser Sheni that's brought, 4 years out of 6 or whatever. It never mentions tithes going to the Levi. The Levi is poor. The Levi doesn't have anything, basically. Therefore, the Torah emphasizes when you have a festival, when you have any kind of rejoicing, or you bring the stuff to Jerusalem, you should share with the Levi. Never mentions the Kohen. So the suggestion, I was just reading, a suggestion. It's something I've thought about a good deal. And I just want to put out there a very interesting thought about Kohanim Leviim. And the thought, this is something really to think about, and this is a big topic. I'm just going to put it out there as food for thought. And that is, when you read the Parsha, Ki yavo halevi me'achad sharecha, without any preconceptions, without trying to work it out with other texts, what it sounds like, obviously, is that the person you're talking about is a Levi. He's not a Kohen. Why do I say he's a Levi? Because it says, Ki yavo halevi. Calls him the Levi. So what is it saying? So the suggestion I saw was this. The Levi comes He comes b'chol avat nafsho, with deep desire, right? The word avat nafsho, what we had earlier, when you desire, you're lusting for meat. This is a Levi who desires with all his soul to go to the place that God is present. V'shereit b'shem Hashem Elohav. He shall serve his God, kechol echav halviyim, together with all his brethren Levites who stand before God, as entitled then to divide everything equally, cheluk b'cheluk yochelu, etc. So the suggestion here is a different suggestion, and that is, who is permitted to serve in the temple? We read the rest of the Chumash, and you read the Gemara, and obviously, who serves in the temple? The Kohen. Now, the Leviim have a job in the temple. They are the assistants to the priest. The Levi is an assistant to the priest. In the Talmud, the Levi has two jobs. The Levi can sing. They're singers, Meshoarim, and they are gatekeepers, Shoarim. Today is Rosh Chodesh. What does it have the davening? Let's see. What does it say there? Now, when we talk about, actually on Yom Tov, we mentioned Hoshev Kohanim Lavodatam Uleviyim L'Shiram Ulezimram. We ask for the restoration of the temple. Restore the priests to their service, sacrificial service. Uleviyim L'Shiram Ulezimram. And restore the Levites to their singing. So the Talmud understands the Levi has a role. The Levi sings. The Levi opens up the doors. But the service of the temple is not done by the Levi. That's the rabbinic understanding. The question is that what it says over here? So the suggestion, I was looking at the work of this fellow Tamir Granot, who's a Rosh Hashiva in Israel. It's a big book on Sefer Devarim, big book. He makes a suggestion. And something I wanted to add a few details to, something really to think about. He says perhaps what the Torah is saying is something else. The Kohen does the service. But what about a Levi who wants to do the service? Levi wants to volunteer, he doesn't have to. But he wants to do it. He wants to join. So what it sounds like is if a Levi desires to serve, he can do it. We accept volunteers. You're not a Kohen. Kohen is the descent of Aaron. But if you want to serve, you're permitted to serve if you decide to serve. You have to do it, and that's what you're going to do. It's not you're coming for 2 weeks and going back to something else. If you decide you want to serve, you can serve with all the other Leviim, because those serving in the temple are not just priests. Those serving in the temple are the priests who by birth are chosen, and then they're the volunteers that are chosen. What makes this, I think, a very interesting suggestion, which I think has a lot to it, is that we do find situations where somebody can serve in the temple who is not a priest. And I'll mention there are two cases. One may be a negative one, and one is obviously positive, but a story that we're all familiar with. And that's the story that appears in chapter 1 of the book of Shmuel. Chana prays for a child. And what does Chana say? If you give me a child, right? I will unetativ l'Hashem kol yemei chayav. I will give this child to you all the days of his life, and he won't have his hair cut. He'll be sort of like a Nazirite. And Samuel is born. And chapter 3 of Samuel, in those days, Samuel was serving God before Eli the priest. Now, what is Samuel doing in the temple? First of all, is Samuel a priest? Samuel is certainly not a priest, that's for sure. He's not a Kohen. It's not clear what he is altogether. From the book of Shmuel, it sounds like he's a regular Yisrael. In the chronology which is found in the book of Chronicles, he's a Levi. I believe he's related to Korach, actually. He's from that side of in Chronicles. In the book of Divrei Hayamim, he comes not from Aaron. He's not from Aaron. So he's not a priest. But when you read the book of Shmuel, You could say he's in the temple serving Eli, he's Eli's assistant, but it doesn't sound that way from the book. Because from the book of Shmuel, first of all, he's sleeping either right next to the Holy of Holies or adjoining it, next to the ark. But we have in the book of Shmuel, he is a judge, he is a prophet, but we have him on more than one occasion bringing sacrifices. In fact, when Saul first meets Samuel in the book of Shmuel, he goes to a town and he asks the girls at the well, they're drawing the water, is there a prophet in this town? Is there a seer? Oh, yes. They're all very excited. Of course, he comes all the time. He brings hu yivorech hazevach. He blesses the sacrifice, and then they eat. And you have it related with David when Samuel is directed by God to appoint King David in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. Sam was afraid to go. Like, how could I go? Appoint a new king. Saul will kill me. That's okay, says God. Say you're going to bring a sacrifice. So he goes to town. He announces there's going to be a sacrifice. He invites the family of Yishai to come, etc. It sounds like he's functioning as a priest. That's what it does sound like. He's a combination of prophet, judge, and priest all rolled up into one. But it does sound like he's a priest. And he's not a Kohen. So what is that about? Is it possible that within the biblical text that to serve in the temple, if you're a priest, you're served by birth? Is it possible to volunteer? Now, maybe it's limited just to the tribe of Levi. Every Kohen is also a Levi. What's actually very interesting about this idea is that certainly there's one of our prophets who seems to suggest that actually anybody can be a priest. Not just the priest by birth, but anybody who chooses to serve God can in fact can serve in the temple. Now, maybe this is a prophecy for the future, but the prophet certainly who seems to suggest that anybody can be a priest, anybody can serve, or anybody will someday serve, is of course Yeshayahu. And he says there are two different passages in the prophet Yeshayahu. There are more than two, but I'll mention two specifically because these are coming from two passages in Sefer in Yeshayahu, which we actually read. We read on special days. The first we read on Yom Kippur, or Yom Kippur or the fast days. Maybe it's, I'll tell you. I think it's the fast on the fast days. It's read on every fast, not Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a different Haftarah, also Yeshayahu, but on the fast days. And the second one is from when Rosh Chodesh falls on Shabbat. Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. So each one has its own special Haftarah. And let me just cite those verses for you. Probably familiar to many of us, but let me just cite them. Let's start with chapter 56 of Yeshayahu. Chapter 56 of Yeshayahu. The Haftorah actually begins in chapter 55. Tirshu Hashem b'hi matzo, kira'u b'yod, very beautiful Haftorah. Seek out God, Tirshu Hashem, seek out God when God can be found. Fine. And it talks about repentance. It talks about repentance. It's read on every fast day. Fast days are days of repentance, etc. And in chapter 56, we have the following verses. Chapter 56, verse number 3, familiar to all of us. Al Yomar ben Hanechar, Hanuva el Hashem lemar, Havdel Yavdilanu Hashem me'alamo, Yavdilani Hashem me'alamo, V'al Yomar Saris Hanani Yetziavesh, Kichol Mar Hashem la Sarisim, Asher Yishmu et Shabtotai uvacharu b'asher chafatzti u'machzikim b'viti, V'notati lahem b'veiti u'vachomotai yod v'shem, Tov mibonimu mibonot, Shem olom etenu Hashem yikaret, U'vnei hanichar, Hanuvim al Hashem u'sharto, U'yavo Hashem u'yoto la'avodim, Kol shomer Shabbat mechalo machzikim b'viti, V'aviotim al har kodshi v'simachim b'veit tfiloti, Olotehem v'zivchehem l'ratzon ha'mizbechi, Ki beti beit tfiloi yikarei l'chol ha'amim, These are familiar passages from the fast day Haftorah. Some of these verses appear in the liturgy of the high holidays. Let not the foreigner say, who has detached himself to God. Talking about, it sounds like a non-Jew. And interesting is, this foreigner, this non-Jew, has attached himself to God. And my point is, what's the word for attached? Nilva. What is Nilva related to? Nilva is related to Levi. In fact, when you think about the tribe of Levi being singled out, why is the tribe of Levi singled out? Because after the golden calf episode, Moshe said, Mi Hashem Eli. Whoever is for God, come to me. And the tribe of Levi came to Moshe. And we think of it as the tribe of Levi. Moshe himself is a Levi, but Levi means to be attached, to connect. The question is, whom do we attach ourselves to? So Yeshayahu says, the B'nai Nechar hanilva el Hashem. This should not say, or the eunuch should not say, I'm a withered tree. No, says Yeshayahu. The eunuchs who keep my Sabbath, who've chosen what I desire, I will give them a monument and a name, Yad Vashem, which shall not perish. Now, what about the foreigners in verse number 6? B'nei hanechar hanilvim al Hashem. Once again, the Levi, l'sharto, to serve. I will bring them to my temple. I will olotehem v'zivchehem l'ratzon. Their sacrifices shall be acceptable. My house is a house of prayer for all the nations. Now, it doesn't say they're actually doing the service over here. It says they are acceptable. I bring them into my temple, etc. But there is even a more remarkable verse in the book of Yeshayahu, and that's towards the very end of the very end of the book, chapter 66. The second part of Yeshayahu, of course, are prophecies of consolation, of Nechama, and it talks about God gathering all the nations. All the nations will be gathered. In chapter 66, beginning in verse number 18, verse 19, V'samti bahem ot, etc. I will send to all the different nations, and they all come from all the different nations. Ahar kodshi Yerushalayim, kasher yoviu b'nei Yisrael et hamincha b'chli tahar beit Hashem, v'gam mehem ekach lakohanim la'alviim omar Hashem. From these people, time has come to gather all the nations and tongues. They shall come and behold my glory. I will set a sign among them, and send them from them survivors to the nations. Tarshish, Pul and Lud, Tubal, Yavon, distant coasts, have never heard my name. They shall declare my glory among the nations. And out of the nations, they shall bring your brothers on horses, chariots, and drays, mules, dromedaries to Jerusalem. Just as the Israelites brought an offering in a pure vessel to the house of God. And the next verse, from them, I will take some to be Levitical priests, says God. It sounds like, actually, these verses, who will God choose to serve? Who are the Kohanim Leviim? Here it sounds like anybody who wants to serve. There's no question that the sense you get in reading Yeshayahu, with all the, obviously the attempt to resolve that with other texts. When you read it in and of itself, it sounds like for Isaiah, anybody can be a priest. Anybody can serve you. If you have the desire and the commitment, you can serve. Now, the question is, coming back to our book, Sefer Devarim, I very much like this idea that I'm not saying that Sefer Devarim simply says that kahuna doesn't exist. I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying something different. I think it's moving in a certain direction. I think these books move us in a certain direction. I think when you read this verse about the Levi, it doesn't say Leviim Kohanim, Kohanim Leviim. The Levi who desires to serve. The Samuel. His mother sends him to serve. He's not a Kohen. But it sounds like when you read the book of Shmuel, he is a Kohen. And by the way, in the book of Samuel, there's another verse about David's children. When he gives a positive biography of David, Bnei David Kohanim Hayu. They were priests. Now, the word Kohen can mean to serve, no question about it, and there are many ways to serve, we know that. But the word Kohen does carry with it a very particular meaning when you hear the word Kohen. So what I'm suggesting here, and I have to stop at this point, is that we have 4 different institutions. We have the prophet, we have the judge, we have the king, and we have the priest, the Kohanim and the Levi'im. The Kohanim and Levi'im, on one hand, seem to be judges. Either they're judging based on their study, their knowledge, or through the access to God, unclear. But in these verses over here, it talks about the rights, the privileges that the Kohen and the Levi get, and their service. And we have this expression, v'shereit b'shem Hashem b'chol avat nafsho. The word avat nafsho, and I conclude with this, the term avat nafsho we encountered earlier, desire to eat meat. Says the Torah, Book of Devarim, you can eat meat, you're far away, provided you slaughter the animal properly and get rid of the blood, you can eat the meat. We recognize human needs, human desires. Over here is a different human desire, a desire to serve. And what the Book of Devarim seems to be saying is, at least in the context of the Levi, for those who truly desire to serve, there has to be the opportunity for them to serve. And that's what it does sound like. If he comes and he commits to serve, he serves like all the others, and he gets his portion together with the others. I have to stop at this point. Now, I mentioned I'm deciding to add 4 more classes, which will begin, I think, in 2 or 3 weeks, to continue with Sefer Devarim with a different topic within Sefer Devarim to be announced. Because of all these various laws, but there's a focus on 2 kinds of laws in Sefer Devarim. Laws related to war, and laws related to personal status, to marriage, etc. And things related to relationships of couples, marriage, etc. So one of those 2 will be the next focus, I think, and we'll announce exactly when and what time. Thank you all for joining.
Yep. And as always, keep an eye on our website, drisha.org/classes, both for the upcoming to be determined continuation of this series on Sundays, continuing at 10 a.m. And also, if you want to keep learning with Rabbi Silber over the summer, he is going to be the next teacher for Mishnah in Depth Kinim, which will be released in 3 videos over the course
So
of
it's going to be
summer.
Kalim.
Kalim.
Kim is this
There's
week,
just
Kalim.
these 2, for those who have been learning Mishnah all along, the last section of Tarot is the most difficult. But if you got this far, you should try to finish it. Let's put it that way. So it's not easy. But I will give 3 general lectures about Kalim. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Chodesh Tov. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chodesh Tov, Chag
Thank you.
Sameach. Thank you.